The Netherlands are wet, flat, and full of stone people. Jean Entwistle. The Netherlands is one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, and it was once the greatest mercantile power on the planet during the 1600s. However, its stature has diminished over time, as Britain, France, Germany, and others have surpassed its power projections. In this video, we will explore the Netherlands' power projections for the present and near future. Let's start off with geography. The most notable aspect of the country is water. Most of the country is at sea level or below. This gives the nation great access to maritime ports, but also makes the land prone to flooding, had it not been for the Dutch mastery of engineering. The highest elevation in the entire mainland is nothing more than a hill. This makes the country very vulnerable to invasions, as there aren't any significant land barriers. Unsurprisingly, the Dutch have been conquered by the Germans, French, and others numerous times. Nonetheless, the Dutch are the best near water. Rotterdam is the country's biggest seaport, and nearly every city is connected by either ocean, river, or canal. To the east of the capital Amsterdam lies a large swath of reclaimed land. Their mastery of engineering can literally be seen from space. This is due in part to the sophisticated system of dikes and levees the Dutch have created that pretty much has been unrivaled elsewhere in the world. Although, granted, their problem is pretty much unrivaled when it comes to flooding too. This land reclamation has led to more abundant farming, another technology that the Dutch are at the cutting edge of. If there's one thing I could say about the Dutch and their land, is that they've managed to transform water from one of their worst enemies to their best friend. However, with climate change and rising sea levels, we don't know how much longer this friendship will last. Before I go on to their current projections, I think it's worth briefly going over their history, and it's a fairly young history. A number of Dutch counties united against the Spanish during the 1600s, given that the Dutch were Protestants and the Spanish were Catholics. And then along with that, you throw in some trade issues, and with the will of self-governance, what do you know, you have an independence movement and your own nation-state. These Protestants settled in the north in the Netherlands, and the Catholics by and large stayed in the south, in what is now Belgium and Luxembourg. In what was the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War. It also ended the Holy Roman Empires, not to be confused with the actual Roman Empires, rule over the area. But I'm not going to bother with that because it will take like 17 hours long to explain. What you should know is that this new republic was remarkably tolerant for its time, bringing in Jews and other minorities, so long as they were willing to do business. The Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC, was founded as the first publicly traded company with an impressive shipping fleet, which managed to outdo its Spanish and Portuguese competitors. The Dutch explorers and merchants managed to found New York, or New Amsterdam at the time. They founded Cape Town and were the first Europeans to discover Australia and New Zealand. Their largest imperial footprint would be in Indonesia, taking over the spice trade from the Portuguese and oftentimes engaging in violence and intimidation to crush the native islanders. The wealth from the spice trade led to an explosion of art, science, and technology. However, this oftentimes did come at the expense of crushing indigenous colonized people. Nonetheless, golden ages do not last forever, and they were eventually defeated by the British in 1784, and later conquered by France, ending the VOC. The lack of natural barriers really didn't help after all. And after becoming independent from France, the mostly Catholic Belgium broke off from the Netherlands. But today their relationship is pretty cool. It's actually really working well. The two nations, with a very close history, culture, politics, and values, who nonetheless love making fun of each other. The Dutch stayed neutral during World War I. They wish they could stay neutral during World War II, but the Germans conquered them anyway. In like 3 days, which isn't that great, until Canada saved them. True story. And after the war, they joined the free trade agreement with nearby countries, which would later become the bedrock of the European Union. They also received money from the US to rebuild and joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as a form of military defense, and they played a broader part in European military and economic affairs. Now let's move on to the economy. Few countries have played a more pivotal role in finance and business than the Netherlands. Not only is it the birthplace of the modern corporation, but also the oldest stock exchange. The modern economy of the country has, by and large, far surpassed the old days of the spice trade and tulips, along with the financial recklessness of tulip mania, the world's first speculative bubble back in 1637. Today, the Dutch are far more responsible and benign than their 17th century ancestors. While nowhere near as powerful of an economy as they were during the 1600s, the Netherlands still ranks as one of the 20 largest economies in the world, which is pretty staggering given their small size. While the country was hit fairly hard by the EU financial crisis during 2008, it fared better than larger European countries like Italy and Spain. The Netherlands also has one of the highest standards of living, low unemployment, stable inflation, and a strong social safety net, as well as a diversified economy. Electronic companies like Philips are from the Netherlands, as is Dutch Shell, the largest still operating company in the country, which is by and large in part due to the large natural gas reserves offshore. The country also has considerable agricultural power and is at the cutting edge of farming technology and is one of the biggest producers of beer, salt, and cheese. However, the country also has become a victim of its own success. Prosperity has led to high cost of living and a lack of supply of affordable housing. So let's move on to government and society. The Netherlands is a constitutional monarchy, which in sharp contrast to many other constitutional monarchies is actually very popular among the general public. They play more of a ceremonial role as the country operates in practice as a republic, ranking high in terms of personal freedoms and civil liberties. When you think of the Dutch and personal freedoms, several things come into mind. Overall, the voting base is densely populated in major urban areas, and these major urban areas also happen to be popular destinations for immigrants. This has led to some issues with social cohesion, given the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment over the past few years, especially in the aftermath of the Syrian refugee crisis. In fact, the Netherlands is the only country with more tolerance for LGBT people than migrants. Nonetheless, the country still benefits from bringing in immigrants, at least in the economic sense. Their native population is very well educated and by and large English speaking. Now let's move on to the military. In the Benelux countries, also known as those Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands have close military cooperation with one another as they're relatively small and have very little natural barriers. By and large, they're squeezed between giants, very powerful countries. And this was once an issue. For this reason, even the naval command under the Netherlands and Belgium are combined under the same leadership. However, there have been some differences, as the Dutch have been more willing to engage in American-led military intervention than neighboring Belgium, the Iraq War being a key example. All of their armies are relatively small, but well-trained and well-equipped. Due to the fact that France, UK, and Germany, and other neighboring countries are part of NATO, this means that the country is no longer paranoid regarding its borders, as all of them are under the same American military hegemony and protection, even if France would like to pretend that such a reality doesn't exist. If you don't know, NATO serves as a multilateral alliance of the US, Canada, and most European nations tied together, namely in the face of Russia. This has been beneficial to the Netherlands despite what you may think of NATO in and of itself. This is because a multinational alliance, defense pact, basically means that all the neighbors are tied together, which makes inter-conflict between them very unlikely. This, along with their economic ties to the EU, means that the Netherlands is highly dependent on its neighbors and vice versa, which decreases the likelihood of war. However, if this system crumbles, expect the Dutch to start investing more heavily into their armed forces. And that brings us to our next subject, foreign affairs. As stated before, the Netherlands has tied its defense to the major world power, the United States, ever since World War II. Many Dutch military officials have attained high rankings within NATO. This is combined with integration with the EU. The origin of the EU dates back to the European coal and steel community, which sought to integrate the coal and steel industries of arch enemies, Germany and France, making them interdependent along with their smaller neighbors. Coal and steel were seen as the two primary resources for war at the time, so by integrating them, it made war in the region far less likely. The Netherlands played a relatively minor role in this arrangement, but it still benefited nonetheless. After World War II, the Netherlands also pretty much relied on the US for defense, as it was the primary leader of NATO, and the modus operandi was keeping the Americans in Europe, the Russians out, and the Germans down. This means that the Netherlands will sometimes engage in military-led affairs by the United States that are by and large of little interest to the Netherlands itself, but a way of paying back the Americans for protection. The Netherlands also maintains close relations with other NATO countries, namely Canada, as Canadian forces liberated the Netherlands from the Germans during World War II. Speaking of those Germans, the Netherlands has mostly forgiven Germany for World War II, as the Germans have gotten a great deal of, let's just say, reconciliation atonement for their sins. At the end of the day, they're bordering the continent's largest economy, which is a massive advantage. But their closest friends are probably the Belgians, despite the fact they love making fun of each other. Sure, they ridicule each other a lot of the time, and Belgium's identity is based off of not being Dutch, but relations between the two are very close nonetheless. The nation also has close relations with its former colonies like Indonesia, despite the historical baggage. Given these circumstances, Dutch foreign relations are in a very good standing point, despite possessing a fraction of the global power it had during the 1600s. If the EU and NATO fall apart, this would mean that the country would face existential risks at the hands of its far more powerful neighbors. Remember that geopolitics are in part due to capacity, not just the current standpoint. So, to conclude, the Netherlands' heyday of being a world power is certainly gone, but it still punches up well above its weight in nearly every category. At the end of the day, the Netherlands' power projection is dependent on the EU and NATO staying intact. If that current order on the continent disintegrates, then the Netherlands will go back to being a tiny power sandwiched between far more powerful antagonistic players. At the end of the day, as stated before, geopolitics isn't just about friendly relations, it's about capabilities. Currently, NATO and the EU are going fairly strong despite some significant challenges and skepticism. In the case of NATO, there's been a lot of questions regarding the efficiency of needing a united alliance against a fairly weak Russia that got humiliated by Ukraine. But nonetheless, the fact that there is a land war on the European continent pretty much fuels the need for the Dutch to spend more money on the military. To be fair to the Netherlands, it doesn't need to worry too much given the fact that it is far away from Russia and by and large doesn't spend any near the same degree of military spending in proportion to the size of its economy as many Eastern European nations do, for obvious reasons given the geography. But if the Germans change their ways, then who knows? The EU is seen as a great achievement in European integration, but also seen as a soulless bureaucracy. Some Europeans of various nations have also brought up issues regarding each nation's sovereignty. However, this hasn't led to any significant degree of resentment towards the EU as it has in, say, the UK. And it's likely that the Netherlands will continue being a member. What's quite astonishing is that the Netherlands, despite being this really flat land that is quite tiny, manages to punch so far above its own weight. Probably one of the most OP'd countries on the face of the planet. And if you're Dutch, that's something to be proud about. Thanks for watching.